you very much for that speech. Now to open the debate inside Up, I call up on the leader of Up. Here.
Everyone hear me?
Yeah, you're audible.
All right. Starting in 3, 2, 1. 3 things in this speech. Firstly, set up about what the interests of the LGBT community are. Secondly, why this is vastly unpopular and unpersuasive as a narrative. And finally, why this is ultimately harmful for trans rights. Rebuttal will be integrated. Firstly, what are the interests of the LGBT community? We counter that these are 2 things. Firstly, to allocate resources that they have in order for campaigning for social change effectively. Note that the amount of resources the LGBT community is finite. They only have so many monetary donations. They only have so much airtime. They only have so much discursive power. It is essential that every piece of this be used strategically. Secondly, I think the LGBT community does want to protect its most vulnerable members. We challenge what opening governments say when they say, it is just gay men who are pushing a lot of narratives within the LGBT community. We would note that most people in the LGBT community are fairly left-wing and are fairly receptive towards the claims that people make who are on the fringes of it. We think that there are other people within the movement who they listen to. Right. Why is this unpopular and unpersuasive? 3 reasons why. Firstly, in the majority of the world, and I'm not just talking about LGBT people, gender is linked to cultural and religious roles, specifically within the developing world, which is where the vast amount of this debate happens. As a consequence, a lot of people are likely to be fairly resistant to gender, to the notion that gender is a social construct. Secondly, it is important to people because they have been socialized over an extended period of time to believe that gender is important. Think about it. The toys that you got when you were a child codified what gender you were. Everyone referred to you as a certain gender. Every single segment of your identity was premised on your gender. Advertisements targeted you and made you think that wearing makeup makes you feel more like a woman, or wearing a suit makes you feel more like a man. I think that combined, these 2 mechanisms create degrees of distrust to make the LGBT movement seem more radical. I think in the counterfactual, a lot of people are fairly open to engaging with the LGBT community when they're seen as people who are similar to you. They just love other people, or they just were born in the wrong body and they want to be more like you. I think when the LGBT community pushes these narratives, it's a lot easier to understand them because you understand them relative to yourself, as opposed to understanding them as a radical fringe group. Thirdly, though, I would note that the feminist movement tends to be fairly pro-choice. They often push narratives such as women should wear whatever they want and celebrate their bodies and celebrate their womanhood. Women derive a lot of power from their femininity. When you wear red lipstick, it makes you feel more powerful. I think that given this, even progressives, even though they don't want to admit it, do like gender and do believe that gender gives them some amount of power or some amount of validation or some amount of identity building. Why is this then an ineffective narrative? I think this just wastes the movement's resources on an unpersuasive narrative. When the motion says aggressively push, this means that every single time you go on air, you have to talk about it. Every single PSA you run, or the vast amount of them, have to be centered around gender being a social construct. When you raise money, it's raising money to promote these initiatives as opposed to raising money for anything else, right? Note that proposition have to prove that this is an effective narrative, given that a vast amount of their benefits are contingent on this narrative being effective. I would note that there are just a variety of competing social forces with substantially more power than the LGBT community. There are advertisements made by corporations who make more money when they sell a pink version of the same item that they would sell to a man, but for a little bit more money. There are parents and grandparents who have been socialized over an extended period of time and genuinely do believe that gender is real and look at you like you're crazy when you say it's a social construct. There are social norms that everyone has been fed from the day that they were born that codify how we think about gender and mean that it's very, very unlikely that the opening government receives any impacts. And I think ultimately this harms movement buy-in for 3 reasons. Why do we reach a tipping point? Firstly, lots of people are already fairly skeptical of the LGBT movement. It does not take a lot to push them one way or another. Secondly, when you do this aggressively, you push this at the expense of pushing any other narratives or at the expense of pushing multiple other narratives within the LGBT community. This means you compromise on a lot of narratives around respectability politics, like trans people are just like you, they were just born in a different body, or gay people are just like you, they just want to marry the person that they love. I think this means that you lose out on a lot of narratives that are otherwise substantially more palatable to people. Thirdly, I think older people just actually hate this. If you go to an 80-year-old woman and you try and tell her, oh, gender is made up, she probably laughs at you because this is just not what she's been told her entire life. I think what this means is you have even just a few people opting out can be quite bad because they talk to their friends. They spread degrees of mistrust about the LGBT communities within their own social networks. I think this multiplies to a lot of people over an extended period of time. Why is this bad? You get fewer donations. You get fewer people turning out to protests. You get fewer people listening when the LGBT community community pushes public service announcements. I think this is terrible because often these are services that only the LGBT community can provide. This is advocacy that only the LGBT community can do, and a lot of it is fairly physical and a lot more needed for gay people than just the idea that gender is a social construct that is already assigned to the LGBT community being propagated. This looks like homeless shelters for homeless LGBTQ youth who are thrown out of their houses. This looks like advocating for gay rights when absolutely nobody else will because it is so far down the agenda. As a consequence, I think that this means people are left in a far more vulnerable state. If I'm a homeless LGBTQ youth, I care more about having a homeless shelter to go to than care about whether or not my grandmother thinks gender is a social construct. I think proposition partially mitigate anti-trans sentiment, but create a new and substantially more severe harm. I'll take a POI quickly from closing government. Opening government? Okay, no engagement. Why is this harmful then for trans rights? I would note that trans people do just think gender is incredibly important to them. This is why they go for gender reaffirming surgery. This is why they undergo surgery that has been very, very rarely experimented on. Surgeries that can often be dangerous and very strenuous and difficult to recover from. Surgeries that drain your bank account because your insurance won't cover them. This is why they undergo these surgeries, in order to have genitalia that matches the way that they feel about themselves and matches the way that they believe themselves to be. I would note that when the LGBT community pushes this narrative and says gender is a social construct, I think this makes trans people feel incredibly hurt because it dismisses the very fact of your existence. When you look in the mirror every single day and the body that you have is not the body that you've always believed you belong in, and when the LGBT community tells you that, oh, this is just a social construct, it's just all made up, I think this is very, very delegitimizing. I think this makes you feel like absolute shit. When the LGBT community tells you that gender is just constructed and it's all made up at the end of the day, I think this makes you feel like you're not being listened to. I think it ultimately alienates you by your own movement, the movement that is supposed to provide a safe haven for you, the movement that looked out for you when absolutely no one else would. I think when they dismiss something that means the world to you, this is a very massive harm. I would note that from opposition, the LGBT community can use the political capital they would otherwise waste on pushing the narrative that gender is a social construct to push pro-trans messaging that helps these people infinitely more than propagating a narrative that nobody is ever going to listen to. I would note people are on the counterfactual, more likely to be susceptible to pro-trans messaging when they're told that these people are just like them, they've just been born into the wrong body. I think it is easier to dismiss their claims, it's easier to dismiss their pushes for gender reaffirming surgery. I think this is a travesty. Proud to oppose.
Thank you very much for that speech. Now we call upon the Deputy Prime Minister here.
Awesome. Can everyone hear me okay?
Yeah, you're audible.
All right. And I am fine with this speech being recorded. Is anyone not ready? I want to start by proving that this narrative and aggressively pushing this narrative is key for trans activism, and that OP's world is one in which you either get trans activism worse or you just get less engagement and buy-in from the mainstream population. Let's start with this claim from the DLO, the LO, which is that gender construct and telling people that gender is a social contract makes trans people feel like shit. First, they can see the argument from Perry's speech that there are still incentives for conservatives to push this on the narrative of the movement regardless. This means that there's a symmetric inclination to believe that some people in the movement buy into this idea. If that then is the tipping point for a trans person feeling like shit or not wanting to be involved, it is non-unique. Second, I just think it's probably untrue. That is, saying that gender is a social construct gives you a wide variety of latitude around how you construct your idea of your own identity and how you express yourself. This is why Perry tells you that the social construct of gender has changed, that in certain places we used to think that pink was inherently masculine and blue was inherently feminine. The point here is that there is no telos for what is the ultimate masculinity, and I just think that most people who think critically about their own gender start to see the gaps and the obvious sort of logical fallacies and the constrained binary way of thinking that they are likely to produce on their side of the house. But second, and this is very crucial, is that as Perry tells you, there's kind of not an alternative for incorporating trans people into the movement in a very compelling way. That is, they say that you can tell trans people that they were just intrinsically masculine but born in a female body. But this is bad because it creates purity testing about what it means to really be trans, which is probably more likely to alienate trans people insofar as it then forces them to do stuff like, quote, act more like the gender or change their behaviorisms or the way in which they dress to try to fit into one gender more clearly. But second, it is just unclear how this is the case. That is, they tell you that the average person generally does think that gender is inherent. All of the arguments they literally give you about makeup and so on. At that point, then there is no space on their side of the house for the general populace to believe gender is not inherent unless they are confronted with an aggressive narrative that asks them not to. Third, I just think that TERFs quite literally prove this argument wrong. That is, this proves it is possible to be a leftist, as their characterization is, or even to be, quote, a radical feminist and still be anti-trans. This is because all the ideas that they talk about being normalized, which is the notion that certain things are intrinsically or ontologically masculine or feminine, like putting on lipstick or so on. The problem is that these groups of feminists then reclaim these ideas as something which is inherent to their identity and push it in opposition to trans people because they think that in order to push for women's rights, they must exclude trans people from that group. Note then that the only possible solvency for that is convincing this group or contingent of people, even on the margins, that trans expression is valid. Why the second reason, though, is just the counterfactual of some narrative is bad. And note that this takes them at their best, which is even if you think that aggressively pushing this narrative is really bad, it's probably worse if only parts of the movement push it instead. There's a few reasons for this. First, there's just a signaling effect that you don't actually care within the movement. That is, if 3 out of the 10 people in charge are talking about this one really important issue, but the other 7 aren't, this sends a signaling effect to those people in the movement who feel disenfranchised because they don't view that their view is being heard. Second, it seems like the movement is divided externally, which creates a lack of buy-in. That is, if I'm a moderate who's interested in knowing what the policy platform of a gay rights movement is, I'm less able to actually determine what that is on their side of the house, and I'm more inclined to think that there are internal divisions over what the policy outcome is likely to be when some people push this narrative, but not others. Third, I think the fact it's controversial to begin with means that, as Perry tells you, it is exactly the thing you are likely to cut in their world when you face any degree of opposition, which means that trans issues, especially given they represent the smallest part of the gay community statistically, are often the most likely to go. All right, let's weigh this argument very clearly. This means that in both worlds, moderates hear a narrative that the gay community is in favor of gender not being a social construct. This means that your grandma sees that on Fox News regardless, because they concede the analysis from Perry's speech about why conservatives have incentives to platform this. Note those incentives are also true in developing world. That is, conservatives in the developing world have massive incentives to paint these movements in this radical brush. And second, to highlight people who are overly radical. Why then do we fall back for that? Because Perry tells you when this actually becomes the main part of the mainstream messaging of your movement, then large numbers of moderate people adopt this position as well. This means that the views that are extraordinarily viewed as ridiculous by the majority of the population are less likely, A, to be platformed on our side of the house because there are fewer of them to cherry pick in the first place, but B, that moderates who are actually curious about what the movement stands for are then actually confronted with an opposing narrative to the Fox News one that only highlights the extremists. Why does this beat all of their arguments? First, because public buy-in from moderates is a precondition to any sort of realistic change for gay people. That is, because gay people are disenfranchised, because they are often the geographic and statistical minority, it is buy-in from moderate voters that is ultimately key to getting any term of structural policy. And structural policy likely is the most important factor because, well, it's structural. That is, it continues to influence the way people live their lives for decades, even after the people who wrote it are all dead and gone. Why then is this uniquely good for trans people? The first mechanism is just people on the ground take it up as part of their own message. Note this is unique because while on their side of the house, there might be some small incentive for me to take this up as a message. On our side of the house, because I view it as one of the core platforms of the movement, I am likely to centralize it in our own identity. This does 2 things. First, it means that people who are internally within the gay community now have aligned incentives because I'm now capable of identifying with someone out that otherwise I might not be able to identify with. I'll take the POI from opening, or for closing rather.
Moderates aren't just watching Fox News. This means moderates are also likely to be exposed of the diversity of opinions on what gender is from the LGBTQ movement.
Right.
It's in Fox News.
This is exactly our argument, which is on both sides of the house, Fox News pushes the extreme narrative. On your side of the house, when moderates watch other news outlets, they don't see anything counteracting this narrative. But on our side of the house, when moderates watch other news outlets, they do see something counteracting this narrative. Okay. Cool. So first, let's just create identification within the group. Their art response to this is, oh, but there's like leftists and stuff. But like, guys, cool. Perry already beat this when he told you that like TERFs exist, that it's possible to be a marginalized group and still disaffiliate with other marginalized groups because you don't personally include them in your notion of identity. Note that we check back against this, and note also this is the precondition to all of their arguments about like trans people and violence. Because if I'm a trans person, a precondition to me actually being safe in the community is feeling welcome to begin with. And on their side of the house, you are just less likely to do so. This is the controlling link to how many trans people end up in homeless shelters in the first place, which is more important than building the shelters after the fact. But second of all, this just means that, I don't know, guys, people are more empathetic to trans people because they can see that people on the margins of this movement, your everyday person, is more likely to center this in conversations with their friends, which in turn normalizes it. For those reasons, very proud to propose.
Thank you very much for that speech. Now to close the debate in the opening half, I call upon the deputy leader of the op. Here.
Sorry, I'm debating from like a weird place because of my bubble tea incident. My favorite thing in debate is when the other team mechanizes our case for us. When open government provides a bunch of context that people currently love the Bible, which is really rigid gender norms, and they're so deep-seated in society, which is why we have to abolish them, and then think that LGBT plus movements in developing countries who are already pretty disliked under the status quo can overcome these gender norms, that is absolute insanity. I'm going to be doing a few things in this speech. Firstly, responding to the only argument I understand from OG about trans individuals. Secondly, more weighing about why alienating people from the movement is going to happen en masse, and it's the most important thing. Then I'm going to run like 3 new arguments to burn CO. Let's start by responding to their argument about trans people. They said this increases pressure to pass, but this is 2 different problems. I can say that gender is important to me, and therefore I might want to present myself as being more masculine in nature without the movement saying there is 100% pressure for all trans individuals to present in the gender that they are transitioning into. Even if there's some more pressure to pass though under their side of the house, the ability to get basic acceptance of the fact that transness matters is more important to get things like basic funding and anti-discrimination protection. And the only way that we get this that goes unresponded to is what Daniela tells you, that to believe that transness matters relies on the belief that gender is relevant to people, or else why should we fund people's surgeries to literally change their genders? Let's start by chatting about buy-in and while the delta here is really massive. I want to start by situating this debate in developing countries for a few reasons. Firstly, the highest number of people in the world live in states that are developing and more conservative. Secondly, queer people here have the lowest degree of rights that exist around the world. And thirdly, these movements tend to be very small under the status quo, meaning they have the least capacity to change gender norms that are going to exist. Why are people going to hate this so much? Daniela flags a couple mechanisms that go unresponded to. Firstly, religion and culture. Religious texts often explicitly say, this is what the man should do and dress like, this is what the woman should do and dress like. Cultural festivities often have things like relatively rigid gender norms. Note, even if the LGBT plus movement says gender doesn't matter, what do you care about more? The Bible that you grew up reading, which says if you violate your gender, you can burn in hell, or a fringe movement that even if you are immoderate, you're already quite distrustful of. A narrative isn't enough. What matters is how you compete and weigh between different identities that are going to exist. Secondly, Daniela explains how deep-seated this is, that it's often your parents or from more conservative generation who you interact with the most and who are your role models telling you this kind of stuff, that it's advertisers who rely on gendered clothes industries to make money, the entire modeling industry. What is bigger in most countries, the entire advertising industry or the LGBT plus community? The tipping point here was so large due to the fact that agents of socialization that are far more proximate to you are now telling you to hate these kinds of narratives, that you listen to your parents more because you grew up with them, you listen to the church more because it tells you that you're going to burn in hell, and you grow to love them. We only hear a couple of feeble responses to this entire characterization. Number 1, but guys, we're moving towards blue and pink not being viewed as being gendered colors. Even if this is true in the West, which by the way, a lot of people still think that blue is the guy color, these are much more smaller changes, and to actually abolish gender in a meaningful sense, like normalize wearing clothes of the other person's gender. Next, they say that moderates are likely to hate these regardless because they view Fox News. Obviously, some radical people are not going to like the movement anyways, but there is a difference. A lot of like people in the middle of the political spectrum can consume some centrist and left-wing media that even if it doesn't love the LGBT plus community, it can portray them in a more sympathetic way, especially due to things like the rise of social media. Additionally, there's left-wing arguments that are forwarded by the movement in terms of why you should opt in. Things like equality, that all individuals deserve basic moral minimums. So people have a competing narrative to join under our side of the house, but this is likely to hugely stagnate this process. The trade-off then that Daniela analyzes is a small, uncertain chance of changing gender norms worth sacrificing the ability of movements to get very important things done. Why is this trade-off not worth it? Firstly, if the movement is smaller in size and has less buy-in, Gov cannot get their case, because to get Gov's case, you need en masse buy-in to the movement. So this argument is logically prior. Secondly, it impacts a higher number of people, not just individuals who feel uncomfortable in their gender, but LGBT plus youth kicked out of their homes need a homeless shelter. A key thing that the LGBT plus movement also does is to try and persuade people on the basis of social norms, i.e. you should hire gay people. You should not engage in things like hate crime through things like public awareness campaigns. You need people in society to actually listen to these kind of campaigns that are going to exist. Additionally, if in the long term you get more buy-in, then when niche parts of the movement say that it's important to accept trans people, that we should be able to experiment with gender, you are more likely to listen. Finally, on this clash, it is possible to move toward a more encompassing understanding of gender without abolishing gender norms in its entirety, right? So say that as a lesbian in the West, I can be a lipstick lesbian and present myself as being very female, but also be more butch. These things say that gender is still valuable, but if the issue is like a box cookie cutter thing, there can still be multiple ways of being feminist within the understanding of gender. What are our new arguments? The first one is about guilt. I think it's terrible to make people in the movement feel guilty for embracing highly gendered expressions. Within queer culture, very gendered expressions are often quite important to people. For example, drag queens find presenting themselves as very female very, very empowering. A lot of lipstick lesbians like the idea of portraying themselves as feeling highly feminine. That's how they perceive their own queer identity. What the movement does is now make people feel like they have to choose between embracing their gender and between embracing their queer identity. Second new contribution, this adds an additional layer of discrimination, but before that, Ilija.
Do you think that women can have penises?
Yeah. Okay, how do we get additional discrimination? When you convince people in the movement, especially queer people who follow the movement the most, that they should stop portraying themselves in very gendered ways, this will increase discrimination toward them in particular, because we're so likely to live in a heteropatriarchal society, meaning that if you have women going into the workplace for lesbians, now saying things like, oh, by the way, I think gender is a social construct, and presenting themselves as being more male, they're likely to be double punished. Firstly, for their queerness, and secondly, for rejecting gender norms as well. You now subject people who are queer to a double jeopardy, where their identity is likely to suffer more, and they're likely to receive lower degrees of opportunity. Next new contribution. This is likely to massively alienate the ability for the queer community to form allies with capitalist organizations. This is due to the fact that the entire clothes industry and the vast majority of the corporate world relies on gender norms in order to be profitable. When you're now peddling a narrative that directly contravenes their economic interests, they're now substantially less likely to fund you. Sure, the incentive to do this under the status quo is often based on things like virtue signaling, but it's still mutually beneficial. These are still massive capital transfers into the LGBT plus movement, who often desperately needs capital in order to engage in things like political lobbying to get basic discrimination protections. Daniela also tells you about the feminist angle here, that it's harder to form a coalition with the feminist movement that embraces gender. This is important because they're often larger in number, i.e. there are a lot of women that are existing. They're often stronger because they started first, and they often have shared goals. So you want them to include LGBT plus protection clauses in the anti-discrimination suits that they are lobbying for.
Thank you very much for that speech. Now to open the debate in the closing half, I call upon the member of government here.
Hi, am I audible?
Yes, you are.
All right, starting in 20 seconds. In a world in which more and more people realize that they don't belong to artificially set boxes, it is incredibly important that the movement is behind them. We want to make three claims from closing government. Firstly, give you actual structural reasons why have more buy-in. Secondly, why even if you don't have more buy-in, why you're likely to have like easier push on other things that are considered more normal by general society. And thirdly, why have moral responsibility towards these people as a movement. Prior to this, however, I just want to address one thing benefiting from opening opposition and presumably closing opposition given that one POI. They both agreed that their side is the one in which tells people that they're in the wrong body, right? We would argue that this is incredibly coercive because if the narrative is wrong body, the expectation is that you should have a change, and this is the expectation from the general society. On our side, we are much more fluid in this. We allow people to have change, though these changes are generally incredibly painful and terrible, but they also can choose not to have these things. Our scale is bigger, and this is less coercive, and more people will feel happy on our side. On their side, people are pushed and coerced into making these changes because they don't necessarily belong into artificially set boxes. The first thing I want to address then is why this works, because opening government doesn't necessarily just presume that people are likely to buy these things. Multiple reasons why this is true. Firstly, a lot of women are likely to support this, right? Notice that this inherently goes against the patriarchal norms that most women feel have for far too long have kept them on the sidelines. Secondly, there are actually studies that say this is a construct done by really sophisticated outlets and things like this. Thirdly, there are a lot of examples that you can push. For example, the fact that red color was considered manly and then womanly, that for example, that long hair was considered firstly manly and then womanly. You can push all of these examples and tell people, look how these norms are changing. This is something that is extremely fluid and people are very likely to buy. Fourthly, media is likely to talk about this a lot and tell you, give you experts and expert opinions, going there and talking about these things. Fifthly, there's going to be more advertisements, companies progressing these things, movies talking about these things, which in it at first may be something that people will rebel against, but long-termly are more likely to accept because they consume this media and are consumed by this media. Sixthly, notice that when you do this aggressively, you get more funding from NGOs and these kinds of things to have research into these things, i.e. have research in the academia. And notice that academia is generally tends to be more left-leaning, but is also full of people who are seeking the truth and these kinds of things. They're the ones that can do all the research and give you structural scientific analysis why this is the case. Finally, you can have more funding from grassroots movements, people that talk on the street and try to persuade people into having different beliefs. All of these are 6 or 7 structural reasons why people are likely to buy into this. I don't necessarily have to prove that this happens all of a sudden. Over time, people are likely to buy these things. At first, being just gay was not accepted, but all of these reasons that I gave you work the same way, and people are much more prone to accepting these people nowadays. But even if this is not true, we claim that you're likely to have a bigger community within the LGBT movement, which you feel safe as a trans person. Why? Because few reasons. Firstly, you feel like someone finally cares about you, right? You have a safe place that you can hide at, place that people understand you and these kinds of things, right? But also, as I already told you, you see that companies are using this. There's media outlets movies and stuff like this. People are talking more about this. You feel more represented. But this is also important in small fringe countries in which these things are not necessarily something that people will talk about. These people necessarily feel like they have a community that finally understands and everything else. Why do we believe that this is very important and the movement has to support them? Notice that the movement has vowed to save people who belong to sexual minorities, right? Now, we would generally say that people gay people that are more conventional and these kinds of things already have a better time, right? Therefore, trans people are the ones that have a worse time and are generally seen as terrible and someone that is completely going against the traditional norms. They're going against the narrative of what is a normal thing. They're going against narratives of what is portrayed as a normal looking person, these kinds of things within the conservative societies. Therefore, we think they're the ones that are mostly under attack and these kinds of things. What is the comparative? When this is not portrayed as a social contract, you are much more likely to be portrayed as a person in the wrong body. You're much more portrayed as a person who has to confront with the traditional norms. We think this is very coercive to a lot of people. These people have a lot more chances to do whatever they feel like on our side of the house when this is something that is represented as that way, in that way, right? But finally, I would suggest this. Look, even if this doesn't work, even if we cannot prove that this is something that people generally buy in, we think that more people are likely to, when this is pushed aggressively, to believe that regular old school gay norms are all of a sudden more okay than they used to be. Notice, if these people who are trans are portrayed as too much, if they go against like traditional societal norms, go against what traditionalists believe is a normal looking person, these kinds of things, like traditional people are much more likely to believe that regular gays are okay if this is the alternative that we are going to have. Notice why this happens for a few reasons. Firstly, they're portrayed as like people that you can actually deal with, you can actually have a conversation, as compared to what is now being pushed by liberal media and liberals all over the world, right? You're also portrayed as a more sensible person, i.e. the person that like looks like more like me, I generally feel I can like have a conversation with or share like something similar in our lives with and everything else. But also it is like portrayed as an overwhelming such thing, right? So you notice that there is an influx of talking about these things. You're much more likely to accept something that is like more okay to you than something that is completely new, something that completely goes against your values, your beliefs, and these kinds of things. The comparative, therefore, is when like you don't push this aggressively, rather just push regular stuff that you've been pushing for decades. Gay people are likely to be seen as something that goes against the traditional norms. But once you introduce something that is for like traditional people seen as too much, as like going against traditional norms in a much more harmful way, they're more likely to see just general gay population as okay because you're closer to them. Therefore, you see like you can like have like more conversations with them, accept them more, and you have thousands of impacts here. How the like lives of these people change, especially in like right-wing countries and however you call these things. We think that you're going to accept these people, but even if you don't, you have other impacts here that tell you that this is something that needs to be pushed as an LGBT movement. Very happy to propose.
Thank you very much for that fine speech. Now to open the debate in closing up, I call up on the member of up. Here. Ilija, you're not muted, but I do not understand what you're saying.
Hey, can you hear me?
Yeah, you're audible.
Okay. By the way, I am fine with streaming. I'm going to talk about two different things in this speech. Firstly, why this aggressive push changes the composition of those who are at the forefront of the movement. And secondly, why this changes the type of policy you push for. So even if opening opposition is right about their buy-in impacts and they get better policy, the type of policy that they push for is meaningfully different than what we're going to prove. So firstly, on the composition of leaders, the thesis of this argument is that when the queer movement adopts such an aggressive push, this changes the composition of those conveying this narrative and makes the queer movement far more exclusive. To be sure, opening opposition makes the version of this argument, which is like, you will alienate people who are on the ground. This argument is about changing the people who rise to the top when you cyclically promote this kind of narrative within internal movement discourse. There are two mechanisms I want to point out for why the type of people who most likely communicate this narrative are going to be relatively out of touch with the diversity of trans experiences that people have. The first reason is that the concept of gender being a social construct will seem relatively academic to people because it involves really complex explanations about the sociological development of gender. So to be nuanced, in the best case of GovBench, you are more likely to platform academics who have a deeper understanding of the sociology behind gender. CT even gives this in one of their mechanisms. But this is actually bad because what it means is that people view your movement as being highly academic and jargony and far less relatable in the first place because it seems like academics are using big words and not making very much sense and are just trying to come up with long-winded justifications for why being genderqueer is a valid identity. This is about perception, not about reality. But secondly, the types of trans activists who you platform are going to be meaningfully different. And the reason for this is that there are many people who do not believe that being genderqueer is indeed a social construct. This includes things like two-spirit people within indigenous communities who view their gender as stemming from their notions of faith. This looks like intersex people whose conception of gender is intrinsically tied to their conceptions of biology. What this means is that the most plausible inference we can make is that these individuals will not want to engage in messaging relating to this narrative and will not want to go to the forefront of the movement propagating this narrative in as much as they feel inherently excluded by it. What is the comparative on this argument? So OO takes up the stance that you will be relatively value neutral, but this is actually good because when you take more of a value neutral stance on where gender comes from, there is more room for inclusivity on our side of the house. So there's more room for two-spirit people within your your movement to begin similarly espousing the advocacy that we need more resources for genderqueer people within Indigenous reservations. There is more room for intersex people to speak up about their relative needs when they're pushing politicians to actually get policy passed in the first place. So the endpoint of this argument is the types of individuals who are conveying your messages are going to be fundamentally different. Keep in mind, any GovWhip response about incentives to do this well doesn't matter. Why? Because this narrative intrinsically is alienating to these people. So it doesn't matter whether you have every incentive to do it well and can package it in nice language. This impact still happens regardless of incentive. It is about capacity. There are a few additional implications of this extension. Firstly, it magnifies all of the opening opposition arguments about support for the movement. Why is this true? Because the leaders at the top are the ones who influence buy-in of the movement. It's not the stance you take more broadly. Why? Because they're the ones who package the message you are conveying to the rest of the movement. They're the ones you interact with at a shelter when you're questioning whether you want to get further involved in the movement and further attend rallies and organizing meetings. What does this mean? We steal all of the DLO weighing about the number of people in your movement, about donations being a prerequisite, about having support more broadly, even their new argument about guilt. Why is that? Because these are the individuals who shape whether those impacts happen in the first place. And these are the individuals who shape whether you as an individual feel preemptively deterred from engaging with the movement in the first place. But secondly, we prove the relevant comparative of the OO argument. DLO is correct. This debate likely has a very large margin, particularly in the developing world. But in as much as we prove that you're more likely to platform, for instance, like Hydra people or Two-Spirit Indigenous activists on our side of the house, those are the individuals who are more familiar with local area dynamics. What does that mean? They know the language they need to use in order to convince local politicians to get the policy changes that we talk about. Versus on Gov's side of the house, when you have academics, for instance, who are involved in academia, you are seen as more imported and Western, and therefore you are far less likely to get buy-in. The third thing to point out is that this argument also has enormous principled weight. And this is for the reason that when movements advocate on behalf of people, they reduce their agency and bargain on their behalf. To be sure, this principle isn't absolute, but it does necessitate a baseline obligation to not take aggressive stances on the identity that individuals have. Obviously, since I proved that this rails against the conceptions that many individuals have of their own identity, this is also a principled affront. So even if opening opposition gives the mechanism for why these individuals will be alienated, we, one, more specifically pinpoint who these individuals are, but two, impacting can still be credited as new extensive material, and a principled argument obviously has immense moral weight in as much as people look to this movement for solace. So even if change doesn't happen on either side of the debate, the way you break the deadlock is the obligation the movement has. Secondly, this is harmful for the types of policy that you push for. And there are a number of mechanisms I want to point out for this. The first is that the types of policies you push for on Gov are going to be worst. Why? Because when you say gender is a social construct, you disavow the idea that it is biologically related. What does that mean? What does that mean? That influences the types of policy you push for because, number one, you want to avoid optical hypocrisy, so you're going to be focusing more on socially driven policy. And secondly, the advocacy you take up has an agenda-setting effect. Before I impact this, OG, please.
Yeah, a lot of your arguments are reliant upon the idea we're advocating that gender doesn't exist. To say gender is a social construct is just to say it's socially determined, not by biology, and you can switch between it. Why does that not include all the marginalized movements?
The whole point is many of the people who I talked about don't believe that it is a social construct in the first place. I already weighed against this when I talked about it's intrinsic to your advocacy. So as I was saying, when you say that gender is a social construct, that shapes the types of policies you push for. What does this mean? You don't push for policies relating to things like gender dysphoria, and it's harder to convince individuals that it is a challenge for trans people that they face many biological challenges. So you're less likely to push for policies related to mental health resources or hormone therapy, and you're more likely to focus on concepts like changing gender markers on passports because you look deeply, deeply hypocritical if you're simultaneously saying gender is a social construct, but also trying to push for biologically driven policies. On the comparative, we are more likely to push for these biologically driven policies in as much as we are more value neutral. And notably, why is that going to be effective? Number one, because you can trivially point to like fMRI scans, for example, that show that, for instance, trans male people have this similar brain structures to cis male people. And notably, this doesn't knife the prior argument about seeming academic because people are more receptive to academic notions of biology, which are harder to refute, whereas it's easier to cast ideas surrounding sociology as being relatively dumb and jargony. So the endpoint of this argument is the direction of policy we get is better. So even if Gov gets more of it, the type of it is less directioned.
Thank you very much for that speech. Now to close the debate inside government, I call up on the GovWhip. Here.
Can you guys hear me?
Yep.
Cool. Like, give me like 10 seconds. Even countries like Serbia have, provided by healthcare free sex reassignment or whatever the PC word now is, surgeries. Even countries like Iran have them. Because for a long time, these things will be seen precisely by the narratives of the opposition, that you are born in wrong body. It's even Serbian Orthodox Church has this notion that you can be born in another body and you should be changed by the operation. Iran punished homosexuality with death, like hangs gays, but they accepted the fatwa from one of the ayatollahs that if Allah made a mistake and put you in the wrong body, that change of the operation can happen. We believe that opposition just doesn't exist in reality. Ideas about hormones and hormone markups exist on their side. Because if women have penises, that means that how you feel as that the gender is a social construct, right? Because the crux of it, like the biological crux of it, is denied. Drag queens that are mentioned by opening position are just going against every single gender norms. They're, men with wigs acting once, sometimes like women, sometimes like men, sometimes something in between, make a joke about it. They just push, like going fluidly from one idea to the other. They even talk about themselves in different genders. When they talk about themselves as a performer, they use she pronouns. When they talk about themselves as a, individual, they use he pronouns, or sometimes, different, sometimes they use they, sometimes they use all these different things. All of these things are showing that people feel that they are fluid and they are more likely to change. So all of these policies about hormone markups exist when we need to put people in one box or the other. This is also the reason why we need to push aggressively, because otherwise we are not helping these individuals. Now, let's respond to the op cases. Firstly, the closing position says, oh, it's going to be seen only as academic. No, we think that the meme that shows Louis XIV with wigs and, high heels just can be mocked and says, haha, traditionally men, wore wigs and something like that. It doesn't have to have Judith Butler and Simone de Beauvoir, ideas here to be pushed. We believe it can also be very relatable. You can just simply say, oh, we are not so easy to put in different boxes. And all people who attend drag shows probably can see that to some extent, how you feel can feel different. Also know that the feminist movement for lots of years has been claiming that these things like the gender is a social contract, and that you just the way how you express your gender doesn't have to do with what you were born with. We believe they just conflate. It has to be, Simone de Beauvoir or something like that. Completely bad response. Then about the alienation. And I really wonder who is going to be alienated. Because if it's about the TERF individuals, those are transphobic individuals. They will be alienated no matter what. If you want to have women that are trans in female-only spaces, they will feel alienated because they feel that something about biology is important to them. They don't care if, Leah Thomas changed their genitals or their hormones or something like that. They just want to have female-only spaces. So these people will not be alienated. You don't get them on any side. But also, these people are radical feminists. These people are, pro-gay, etc. So you're not alienated from the rest of the movement. So we're not sure what exactly the alienation is. Then there is alienation from opening opposition a bit later about conservative individuals. You know what? All of the things, and the only explanation, the only mechanism is, look, this is how we see things now. And then if we do something that is against what we do see in them now, like against the gender, there's going to be backlash. That was same in 1916 when women couldn't sign, the law, couldn't get the loan without male approval, or when women couldn't get abortion. These things changed. It was same when men in 1970s couldn't, sleep with other men. It was seen as sinful. All of these things happen. New generation come. Things change, etc. We are not sure why these alienation that they have an open position are inherent or exclusive. But moreover, note that we tell you that also we can flip all of their mechanisms for alienation. They say, but what about clothing? They have a gender, binary clothing, etc. Probably it's going to be very good thing for a company, and it's already happening, for example, with Benetton, that they are having a gender-neutral clothing. They're going to have a first-mover advantage, and probably they are going to be influenced exactly when you have aggressive pushing towards these narratives. And not only when you say, oh, we don't care, and things like that. When we push that in the spotlight, then we have that mechanism. Similar with media. Have you seen the new, like, Sex and the City, what's it called? Yeah, and just like that. They have non-binary individuals. They have Miranda's lesbian, but also sort of being a fluid, etc. They have so much fluidity in it. Media, Hollywood is even having quotas for representation of certain kinds. We don't see why these media cannot help with these things, while they would necessarily be conservative. Just all these mechanisms they have, we have them on our side. But then these all virtue signaling of the media, well, I'll give it in a second, will happen precisely when you have aggressive pushing towards these ideas, because otherwise the opening position themselves say is going to be so natural for people to see themselves in boxes, meaning that naturally the dominant thing would be something that is heteronormative. You need to behave one way or another. There is no in between. Before I proceed, Naomi.
You can't just say if it doesn't work in the short term, it will work in the future. The point is that if there is short-term backlash, the movement becomes too weak to shape future gender norms, let alone the fact you don't engage with the fact that abolishing gender is bad because it helps trans people if gender is important.
I mean, if there is a short-term backlash, these people, all the grannies, probably are backlashed on both sides of the house. New generations that that see the Sex and the City spin-off, that see Benetton's clothing that has, gender-neutral clothes, etc., that see movement that is gaining more popularity, claiming this, probably change their opinions. And then the backlash is short-term, right? Also, all these, whatever they do. But let's see what we were able to prove in itself. I think two things, no matter what. One, the community for individuals that are gender fluid, trans, etc., they're going to feel as they're part of something. This is, no matter what, even if most of the people don't buy, this is a still argument that is existing on CG. We gave you reasons why they are the most vulnerable minorities and why we should have moral obligation towards that specific minority. These are also the non-binary people in Serbia. They can feel that they are part of the movement, that there are people aggressively talking about them, that they can actually feel that they are good about themselves because they, for example, want to have, I don't know, beard and also feel as, and also are female. Also, secondly, for the conventional stuff, that Ben Shapiro is not talking about gay marriage anymore. They're just conceding lots of these stuff that were controversial before, because nowadays then the conventional stuff just seems like more like something that these policies just more likely to accept. For these reasons, very proud to propose.
Thank you very much for that speech. Now to close the debate as a whole, I call up on the up whip. Here.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
POIs in the chat exclusively, please. Also, Matt, could I ask that you turn your video on, just so I'm not speaking to black boxes? Thank you. The problem with opening opposition is they make a massive logical leap because they do not explain why the LGBTQ movement saying gender isn't a social construct means the LGBTQ movement is apparently telling people that gender should be abolished and that it means nothing, including to trans people themselves. What Matt gives you an extension is an explanation for why, even if you as the movement isn't advocating for the literal abolition of gender, but simply communicating OG's nuanced narrative of you thinking gender is a social construct, this fragments the movement and it changes its composition of leadership in a way that damages its ability to protect the trans people closing government claims we have a moral obligation to. Let me start with some rebuttal to closing government's extension. Their first claim is we have more buy-in, and they give you 7 mechanisms that I think pretty clearly illustrate the biggest problem in modern debating, where they give you 7 sentences, each of them describing a bunch of different avenues like the news media, entertainment, and culture for how things will be repetitively consumed, and then do not explain why that repetitive consumption leads to any social change whatsoever. I have 4 responses to this claim on buy-in. Number 1, the media is reluctant to platform this narrative. So all the avenues they describe, like the news media, the entertainment, and culture, realize this is an unprofitable narrative to platform insofar as large numbers of people believe that gender is not a social construct. One movement telling you that it is insufficient for you to think this is worth platforming. Second, repetition can have the opposite effect, flipping their claim, because repetitively having a message that challenges your intuitions about about the world doesn't make you think, hey, I've heard this message 300 times rather than 30 times. Let me change my mind right now. Rather, it can make you feel frustrated as an individual about not being heard by what the movement is telling you. Third, it's unclear why these messages reach moderates or conservatives. Lots of people live in social echo chambers due to things like social media algorithms and the types of media that they consume. So the fact these messages are coming onto media does not mean you will be exposed to them. But fourth, flip this argument. This actually creates a narrative that makes it easy to blame trans people. Why? Because if you view this as a social construct, then you can easily think, well, being trans is a choice. And then when you're flooded with conservative narratives about how trans people are dangerous, you can think, why did you make this decision to cause this trauma to happen to yourself? The only mechanism from closing government is, look, guys, norms change over time. This happened with gay rights already. Why can't it happen with believing gender as a social construct? But norm change doesn't happen by waving a wand. It happens because of disciplined social movements that often take compromises and try to appeal to broad bases of buy-in, like the queer movement in the United States, transitioning to focusing on marriage equality rather than marriage abolition to get broader buy-in. Their second claim is the alternative is a construct that believes that the person is in a wrong body and this is coercive to them because it causes them to try to change their biology. It causes them to seek things like surgery. What if people are not open to seeking things like surgery? Number one, they do not explain why this is the alternative. On our side of the house, we're happy to advocate a movement that is agnostic about the precise definition of gender rather than simply attracting itself to a biological one and pushing a broader narrative that says different trans people interpret and interact with their gender in different ways. Some might think it's a social construct, but many trans people think it is predetermined for them, not just due to their biology, but due to things like their faith and their religion. There are a bunch of other narratives we can push. But Ilya's examples at the start of his speech flip the argument for us, because he himself says Iran was willing to accept a fatwa that allowed sex reassignment surgery to happen. What that means is the narrative that people are in the wrong body, even if it's not true of most trans people, is a pretty good narrative to push for trans acceptance. Finally, they claim there is a moral obligation to this specific community. If we prove we help the trans community more, we win on this very obligation. Let me talk about our extension and how it weighs against opening opposition. We give you three mechanisms in our extension that get overwhelmingly strawman. The first one is about fragmenting the movement. Trans people are not a monolith. Some of them engage with viewing gender as a social construct. Many other trans people, including heavily disadvantaged trans people in contexts like indigenous communities, the two-spirit people, or people who define their gender based on their religion, do not view it as a social construct. By picking one narrative over another, you are fragmenting the trans movement and making it substantially weaker, disabling its ability to achieve its aims. Second, you are making the movement academic and exclusive. Ilya's response, they do not explain why it happens to be Judith Butler and Simone de Beauvoir. You can easily make this messaging inclusive. You can, but Matt gives you the structural reasons for why you won't that they ignore. Reason one, you are likely to draw heavily on the origins of gender as a social construct. So people who are key leaders within the feminist movements often emerge from things like humanities education. This is the first place where they heard what gender being a social construct is. But second, communication. Even if the movement doesn't overposition Judith Butler gets a lot more attention for being the first person to say gender as performative when the movement does this, meaning media organizations approve them and they become a symbol for the movement. But third, we change the composition of the movement by making it less exclusive. How does this weigh against opening opposition? The first is it goes beyond their mechanism, because their mechanism simply assumes that claiming gender as a social construct means believing gender is irrelevant and ought to be abolished. So all their arguments about acceptance by conservative communities, for example, seems to assume that people will be really mad because gender is an important part of their lives, or trans people will be really annoyed because gender is important to trans people. But at no point did the gov bench say, we think gender is completely unimportant. Our mechanism makes a much cleaner link to explaining why any version of claiming gender as a social construct is bad. Before I complete this weighing, opening government, do you have a POI?
Given our argument that mainstream media in conservative countries are likely to platform the idea that gay people are pro this idea anyway, you still alienate trans people. We turn that because we check back.
Let me just finish this weighing. Okay, the second thing is they lack a comparative, because opening opposition themselves identify the religious texts that tell people that gender is a binary, that trans people are bad, but they do not explain why the movement has a comparative pathway to actually helping trans people. What we say is if the external buy-in isn't possible, at least we get internal mobilization. We get people on the streets and we get people protesting, unlike their side of the house that actually alienates people. Finally, on opening government, their core claim is conservatives will paint the LGBTQ movement as believing a more extreme version of this. Two responses. One, conservatives can weaponize their unified narrative too, because if the LGBTQ movement more broadly says gender is a social construct, it's easy for conservatives to paint this as them saying gender doesn't exist. By the way, this response mechanizes the opening opposition case, because the point is the conservative movement can say they think it's a social construct. Thinking it's a social construct means thinking it is imaginary, and present their ideas in this way. But second, on our side, the movement doesn't not have a counter narrative. It doesn't say nothing. Instead, it says many different definitions of gender are consistent with trans rights. For example, biology influence is consistent when you see that trans men, for example, have brains more similar to cis men. Non-biological definitions that come from things like faith are consistent, and the social construction is consistent, thus beating OG's echo chamber claim. For all these reasons, very proud to.
Thank you very much for